of the nature of philosophical analysis. From our assertion that philosophy provides definitions, it must not be inferred that it is the function of the philosopher to compile a dictionary in the ordinary sense. For the definitions which philosophy is required to provide are of a different kind from those which we expect to find in dictionaries. In a dictionary, we look out mainly for what may be called explicit definitions. In philosophy, for definitions in use. A brief explanation should suffice to make the nature of this distinction clear. We define a symbol explicitly when we put forward another symbol for symbolic expression which is synonymous with it. And the word synonymous is here used in such a way that the two symbols belong to the same language, can be said to be synonymous if, and only if, a simple substitution of one symbol for the other in any sentence in which either can significantly occur always yields a new sentence which is equivalent to the old. And we say that two sentences of the same language are equivalent if and only if every sentence which is entailed by any given group of sentences in conjunction with one of them is entailed by the same group in conjunction with the other. And in this usage of the word entail, a sentence is said to entail a sentence when the proposition expressed by it is deducible from the proposition expressed by it, while a proposition, oh, okay, there's a, and this usage of the word entail, a sentence S is said to be entail a sentence a T when the proposition expressed by T is deducible from the proposition expressed by S, while a proposition P is said to be deducible from or to follow from the proposition Q when the denial of P contradicts the assertion of Q. The provision of this criteria enables us to see that the vast majority of the definitions which are given in ordinary discourse are explicit definitions. In particular, it is worth remarking that the process of defining per genus et differentiam, to which Aristotelian logicians devote so much attention, always yields definitions which are explicit in the foregoing sense. Thus, when we define an oculist as an eye doctor, what we are asserting is that, in the English language, the two symbols oculist and eye doctors are synonymous. And generally speaking, all the questions that are discussed by logicians in connection with this mode of definition are concerned with the possible ways of finding synonyms in a given language for any given term. We shall not enter into these questions ourselves because they are relevant to our present purpose, which is to expound the method of philosophy. For the philosopher, as I have already said, is primarily concerned with the provision, not the explicit definition, but of definitions in use. We define a symbol in use not by saying that it is synonymous with some other symbol, but by showing how the sentences in which it significantly occurs can be translated into equivalent sentences, which contain neither the definiendum itself nor any of its synonyms. A good illustration of this process is provided by Bertrand Russell's so-called theory of definite descriptions, which is not a theory at all in the ordinary sense, but an indication of the way in which all phrases of the form the so and so are to be defined. It proclaims which contains a symbolic expression of this form and is translated into a sentence which does not contain any such expression, but does contain a sub-sentence asserting that one and only one object possesses a certain property, or else that no one object possesses a certain property. Thus, the sentence, the round square cannot exist, is equivalent to no one thing can be both a square and round, and the sentence, the author of Waverley was Scotch, is equivalent to one person and one person only wrote Waverley, and that person was Scotch. The first of these examples provides us with a typical illustration of the way in which any definite descriptive phrase which occurs as the subject of a negative existential sentence can be eliminated, and the second with a typical illustration of the way in which any definite descriptive phrase which occurs anywhere in any other type of sentence can be eliminated. Together, therefore, They show us how to express what is expressed by any sentence which contains a definite description phase, definite descriptive phase without employing any such phase. And last, they furnish us with a definition of these phrases in use. The effect of this definition of descriptive phrases, out of all good definitions, is to increase our understanding of certain sentences. And this is a benefit which the author of such a definition confers not only on others, but also on himself. It might be objected that he must always understand the sentences in order to be able to define the symbols which occur in them. But this initial understanding need not amount to anything more than an ability to tell in practice what sort of situations verify the propositions they express. Such an understanding of sentences containing definite descriptive phrases may be possessed even by those who believe that they are subsistent entities, such as the round square or the present king of France. But the fact that they do maintain this shows that their understanding of these sentences is imperfect. For their lapse into metaphysics is the outcome of the naive assumption that descriptive phrases are demonstrative symbols. And in the light of the clearer understanding which is afforded by Russell's definition, we see that this assumption is false. Nor could this end have been achieved by an explicit definition of any descriptive phrase. What was required was a translation of sentences containing such phrases which would reveal what may be called their logical complexity. In general, we may say that it is the purpose of a philosophical definition to dispel those confusions which arise from our imperfect understanding of certain types of sentence in our language, where the need cannot be met by the provision of a synonym or a symbol, either because there is no synonym or else because the available synonyms are unclear in the same fashion as the simple to which the confusion is due. That's brilliant. A complete philosophical elucidation of any language would consist first in enumerating the types of sentence that were significant in that language, and then in displaying the relations of equivalence that held between sentences of various types. And here it may be explained that two sentences are said to be of the same type, and they can be correlated in such a way that to each symbol in each sentence there corresponds a symbol of the same type in the other, and that two symbols are said to be the same type when it is always possible to substitute one for the other without changing a significant sentence into a piece of nonsense. Such a system of definitions in use would reveal what may be called the structure of the language in question. And thus we may regard any particular philosophical theory, such as Russell's theory of definite definitions, as a revelation of part of the structure of a given language. In Russell's case, the language is the everyday English language, and any other language, such as French or German, which has the same structure as English. And in this context, it is not necessary to draw a distinction between the spoken and the written language. As far as the validity of a philosophical definition is concerned, it does not matter whether we regard the symbol, defined as being constituted by visible markers or by sounds. A factor which complicates the structure of a language, such as English, is the prevalence of ambiguous symbols. A symbol is said to be ambiguous when it is constituted by signs which are identical in their sensible form, not only with each other, but also with signs which are elements of some other symbol. For what makes two signs elements of the same symbol is not merely an identity of form, but also an identity of usage. Thus, if we were merely guided by the form of the sign, we should assume that the is which occurs in the sentence, he is the author of that book, was the same symbol as the is which occurs in the sentence, a cat is a mammal. But when we come to translate the sentences, we find that the first is equivalent to He and no one else wrote the book, and the second two, the class of mammals contains the class of cats. And this shows that in this instance, each is an ambiguous symbol which must not be confused with the other, nor with the ambiguous symbols of existence. And class membership and identity and entailment, which are also constituted by signs of the form is. To say that a symbol is constituted by signs which are identical with one another in their sensible form and in their significance, and that a sign is a sense content or a series of sense contents which is used to convey literal meaning, is not to say that a symbol is a collection or system of sense contents. For when we speak of certain objects, A, B, C, D, as being elements of an object E, and of E as being constituted by B, C, D, we are not saying that they form part of E in the sense in which my arm is a part of my body. For a particular set of books on my shelf is part of my collection of books. What we are saying is that all the sentences in which the symbol E occurs can be translated into sentences which do not contain E itself or any symbol which is synonymous with E, but do contain symbols A, B, D. In such saying that the introduction of symbols which denote logical constructions is a device which enables us to state complicated propositions about the elements of these constructions in a relatively simple form. What one must not say is that logical constructions are fictitious objects. For while it is true that the English state, for example, is a logical construction out of individual people, and that the table at which I am writing is a logical construction out of sense contents, it is not true that either the English state or the table is fictitious in the sense in which Hamlet or a mirage is fictitious. Indeed, the assertion that tables are logical constructions out of sense contents is not a factual assertion at all, in the sense in which the assertion that tables were fictitious objects would be a factual assertion, albeit a false one. It is, as our explanation of the notion of a logical construction should have made clear, a linguistic assertion to the effect that the symbol table is definable in terms of certain symbols which stand for sense contents, not explicitly, but in use. And this, as we have seen, is tantamount to saying that sentences which contain the symbol table or the corresponding symbol in any language which has the same structure as English can all be translated into sentences of the same language which do not contain that symbol or any of its synonyms, but do contain certain symbols which stand for sense contents. A fact which may be loosely expressed by saying that to say anything about a table is always to say something about sense contents. This does not, of course, imply that to say something about a table is ever to say the same thing about the relevant sense contents. For example, the sentence, I am now sitting in front of a table, can in principle be translated into a sentence which does not mention tables, but only sense contents. But this does not mean that we can simply substitute a sense content symbol with the symbol table in the original sentence. If we do this, our new sentence, so far from being equivalent to the old, will be a mere piece of nonsense. If we obtain a sentence which is equivalent to the sentence about the table, but refers to sense contents instead, the whole of the original sentence has to be altered. And this, indeed, is implied by the fact that to say that tables are logical constructions out of sense contents is to say not that the symbol table can be explicitly defined in terms of symbols which stand for sense contents, but only that it can be defined in use. For, as we have seen, the function of a definition in use is not to provide us with a synonym for any symbol, but to enable us to translate sentences of a certain type. The problem of giving an actual rule for translating sentences about a material thing into sentences about sense contents, which may be called the problem of the reduction of material things to sense contents, is the main philosophical part of the traditional problem of perception, of the traditional problem of perception. It is true that writers on perception who set out to describe the nature of a material thing believe themselves to be discussing a factual question. But, as we have already pointed out, this is a mistake. The question, what is the nature of a material being, is like any other question of that form, a linguistic question being a demand for a definition. And the propositions which are set forth in answer to it are linguistically are ling- and the propositions which are set forth in answer to it are linguistic propositions, even though they may be expressed in such a way that they seem to be factual. They are propositions about the relationship of symbols and are not about the properties of the things which the symbols denote. It is necessary to emphasize that this point in connection with the problem of perception, since the fact that we are unable in our everyday language to describe the properties of sense contents with any great precision for lack of the requisite symbols makes it convenient to give the solution of this problem in factual terminology. We express the fact that to speak about material things is, for each of us, a way of speaking about sense contents by saying that each of us constructs material things out of sense contents, and we reveal the relationship between the two sorts of symbols by showing what the principles of this construction. In other words, one answers the question, what is the nature of a material thing, by indicating in general terms what are the relations that must hold between any two of one's sense contents for them to be elements of the same material thing. The difficulty, which here seems to arise, of reconciling the subjectivity of sense contents with the objectivity of material things will be dealt with in a later chapter of this book. The difficulty, which here seems to arrive, of reconciling the subjectivity of sense contents with the objectivity of material things will be dealt with in a later chapter of this book. The solution which we shall now give to this problem of perception will serve as a further illustration of the method of philosophical analysis. To simplify the question, we introduce the following definitions. We say that two sense contents directly resemble one another when there is either no difference or only an infinitesimal difference of quality between them, and that they resemble one another indirectly when they are linked by a series of direct resemblances, but are not themselves directly resemblant, or a relationship whose possibility depends on the fact that the relative product of infinitesimal differences in quality is an appreciable difference in quality. And we say that two visual or tactual sense contents are directly continuous when they belong to successive members of a serial or actual or possible sense fields, and there is no difference or only an infinitesimal difference between them with respect to the position of each in its own sense field, and that they are indirectly continuous when they are related by an actual or possible series of such direct continuities. And here it should be explained that to say of a sense experience or a sense field which is a part of a sense experience, or a sense content which is a part of a sense field, that it is possible as opposed to actual, is to say not that it ever has occurred, will occur in fact, but that it would occur if certain specifiable conditions were fulfilled. When it is said that a material thing constituted by both actual and possible sense contents, all that is being asserted is that the sentences referring to sense contents, which are the translations of the sentences referring to any material thing, are both categorical and hypothetical. And thus the notion of a possible sense content or sense experience is an unobjectable is as unobjectable as the familiar notion of a hypothetical statement. Relying on these preliminary definitions, one may assert with regard to any two of one's visual sense contents, with regard to any two of one's tactual sense contents, that they are elements of the same material thing if and only if they are related to one another by relation of direct or indirect resemblance in certain respects, and by a relation of direct or indirect continuity. And as each of these relations is symmetrical, that is to say, a relation which cannot be between any terms A and D without also holding between B and A, and also transitive, that is a relation which cannot hold between term A and another term B, and between B and another term C without holding between A and C, it follows that the groups of visual and tactual sense contents, which are constituted by means of these relations, cannot have any members in common. And by means that no visual, and this means that no visual or tactual sense content can be an element of more than one material thing. The next step is an analysis of the notion of a material thing, is show how these separate groups of visual and tactual sense contents are correlated. And this may be effected by saying that any two of one's visual and tactual groups belong to the same material thing when every element of the visual group, which is of minimal visual depth, forms part of the same sense experience as an element of the tactual group, which is of minimal tactual depth. We cannot here define visual or tactual depth otherwise than ostensively. The depth of a visual or tactual sense content is as much a sensible property of it as its length or breadth. But we may describe it by saying that one visual or tactual sense content has a has a greater depth than another when it is further from the observer's body, provided that we make it clear that this is not intended to be a definition, for it would clearly vitiate any reduction of material things of sense contents if the defining sentences contained references to human bodies, which are themselves material things. We, however, are obliged to mention material things when we wish to describe certain sense contents, because the poverty of our language is such that we have no other verbal means of explaining what their properties are. As for the sense contents of taste, or sound, or smell, which are assigned to particular material things, they may be classified by reference to their association with tactual sense contents. Thus, we assign sense contents of taste to the same material things as the simultaneously occurring sense contents of touch, which are experienced by the palate, or the tongue. And in assigning an auditory or olfactory sense content of a material thing, we remark that it is a member of a possible series of temporarily continuous sounds, smells, or smells of uniform quality but gradually increasing intensity, the series, namely, which one would ordinarily be said to experience in the course of moving towards the place from which the sound or the smell came, and we assign it to the same material thing as the tactual sense content which is experienced at the same rhyme as the sound or the smell of maximum intensity in the series. What is next required of us, who are attempting to analyze the notion of a material thing, is the provision of a rule of translating sentences which refer to the real qualities of material things. Our answer is that to say of a certain quality that it is the real quality of a given material thing is to say that it characterizes those elements of the thing which are the most conveniently measured, all the elements which possess qualities of the kind in question. Thus, when I look at a coin and assert that it is really round in shape, I am not asserting that the shape of the sense content, which is the element of the coin that I am actually observing, is round, still less that the shape of all the visual or tactual elements of the coin is round. What I am asserting is that roundness of shape characterizes those elements of a coin which are experienced from the point of view which measurements of shape are most certainly most conveniently carried out. And similarly, I assert that the real color of the paper on which I'm writing is white, even though it may not always appear to be white, because whiteness of color characterizes those visual elements of the paper which are experienced in the conditions in which the greatest discrimination of colors is possible. And finally, we find relations of quality or position between material things in terms of relations of quality or position which obtain between such privileged elements. This definition, or rather, this outline of a definition of symbols which stand for material things, is intended to have some sort of effect as the definition of descriptive phrases, which we gave as our original example, or the process of philosophical analysis. It serves to increase our understanding of the sentences in which we refer to material things. In this case, also, there is, of course, a sense in which we already understand such sentences. Those who use the English language have no difficulty in practice in identifying the situations in which the situations which those who use the English language have no difficulty in practice in identifying the situations those who use the language have no difficulty in practice in identifying the situations which determine the truth or falsehood of such simple statements as this is a table or pennies are round. But they may very well be unaware of the hidden logical complexity of such statements, which our analysis of the notion of a material thing has just brought to light. As a result, they may be led to adopt some metaphysical belief, such as the belief in the existence of material substances or invisible substrata, which is a source of confusion in all their speculative thought. And the utility of the philosophical definition which dispels such confusions is not to be measured by the apparent triviality of the sentences which it translates. It is sometimes said that the purpose of such philosophical definitions is to reveal the meaning of certain words or combinations of symbols. The objection to this way of speaking is that it does not give an unequivocal description of the philosopher's practice. Well, but it employs in meaning a highly ambiguous symbol. It is for this reason that we defined the relation of equivalence between sentences without referring to meaning. And, indeed, I doubt whether all the sentences which are equivalent, according to our definition, to have the same meaning. For I think that although a complex sign of the form, the sentences S and T have the same meaning, is sometimes used or taken to express that what we express by saying the sentences S and T are equivalent. This is not the way in which such a sign is most commonly used or interpreted. I think that if we are to use the sign meaning in the way in which it is most commonly used, we must not say that two sentences have the same meaning for anyone, unless the occurrence of one always has the same effect on his thoughts and actions as the occurrence of the other. And clearly, without having the same effect on anyone who employs the language. For instance, P is a law of nature is equivalent to P is a general hypothesis which can always be relied on. But the associations of the symbol law are such that the former sentence tends to produce a very different psychological effect from its equivalent. It gives rise to a belief in the orderliness of nature and even in the existence of a power behind that orderliness, which is not evoked by the equivalent sentence and has indeed no rational warrant. Thus, there are many people for whom these sentences do, in this common sense of meaning, have different meanings. And this, I suspect, accounts for the widespread reluctance to admit what the laws of nature are, to admit that the laws of, and this I suspect, and this I suspect accounts for the widespread reluctance to admit that the laws of nature are merely hypotheses, just as the failure of some philosophers to recognize that material things are reducible to sense contents is very largely due to the fact that no sentence which refers to sense contents ever has the same psychological effect on them as a sentence which refers to a material thing. But as we have seen, this is not a valid ground for denying that any two such sentences are equivalent. Accordingly, we should avoid saying that philosophy is concerned with the meaning of symbols because the ambiguity of meaning leads the undiscerning critic to judge the result of a philosophical inquiry by a criterion which is not applicable to it, but only by an empirical inquiry concerning the psychological effect which the occurrence of certain symbols has on a certain group of people. Such empirical inquiries are indeed an important element in sociology and in the scientific study of a language, but they are quite distinct from the logical inquiries which constitute philosophy. It is misleading also to say, as some do, that philosophy tells us how certain symbols are actually used. This suggests that the propositions of philosophy are factual propositions concerning the behavior of a certain group of people, and this is not the case. The philosopher who asserts that in the English language the sentence, "the author of Waverley was Scott," is equivalent to one person and one person only wrote Waverley, and that person was Scotch, is not asserting at all, or most English speaking people use the sentences interchangeably. What he is asserting is that, in virtue of certain rules of entitlement, naming those which are characteristic of correct English, every sentence which is entailed by "the author of Waverley was Scotch" in conjunction with any group of sentences is entailed also by that group, in conjunction with one person and one person only wrote Waverley, and that person was Scotch. That English speaking people should employ the verbal conventions that they do is indeed an empirical fact. Hmm. But the deduction of relations of equivalence from the rules of entailment which characterize the English or any other language is a purely logical activity, and it is in this logical activity and not in any empirical study of the linguistic habits of any group of people that philosophical analysis consists. Hmm. But the deduction of relations of equivalence from the rules of entailment, but the deduction of relations of equivalence from the rules of entailment which characterize the English or any other language is purely logical activity. It is in this logical activity and not in any empirical study of the linguistic habits of any group of people that philosophical analysis consists. Thus, in specifying the language to which he intends his definitions to apply, the philosopher is simply describing the conventions from which he is. Footnote 8. There is a ground for saying that the philosopher is always concerned with an artificial language, for the conventions which we follow in our actual usage of words are not altogether systematic and precise. Thus, in specifying that language to which he intends his definitions to apply, the philosopher is simply describing the conventions from which his definitions are deduced, and the validity of the definitions depends solely on their compatibility with these conventions. And in most cases, indeed, the definitions are obtained from conventions which do, in fact, correspond to the conventions which are actually observed by some group of people. And it is a necessary condition of the utility of the definitions as a means of clarification that this should be so. But if but it is a mistake to suppose that the existence of such a correspondence is every part of what the definitions actually assert. It is to be remarked that the process of analyzing a language is facilitated if it is possible to use for the classification of. It is to be remarked that the process of analyzing a language is facilitated if it is possible to use for the classification of its forms an artificial system of symbols whose structure is known. The best known example of such a symbolism is the so-called system of logistic, which was employed by Russell and Whitehead in their Principia Mathematica. But it is not necessary that the language which analysis is carried should be different from the language analyzed. If it were, we should be obliged to propose, as Russell once suggested, that every language has a structure concerning which in the language cannot be said, but that there may be another language dealing with the structure of the first language, and having itself a new structure, and that to this hierarchy of languages there may be no limit. This was written presumably in the belief that an attempt to refer to the structure of a language in the language itself would lead to the occurrence of logical paradoxes. But Carnap, by actually saying out such an analysis, has subsequently shown that a language can, without self contradiction, be used in the analysis of itself.